A blessed Sunday to everyone. Good evening. We thank the Lord for another opportunity that He has given us to listen to His Word, worship Him, thank Him for who He really is and what He's been doing in each one's life. I'm excited for tonight's message because this is going to be the last portion of the series that we started during the first Sunday of February. This is going to be the last part of the series called Relationships. As I've told you during the first Sunday, every relationship that we have in this life, in this world where we live in, it affects us, it has a touch on us, it leaves a mark in our lives. And the most basic relationship that really affects everything in our existence is our relationship with God. And we talked about it during the first Sunday. On the second Sunday, we discussed about our relationship with God affecting our relationship within the family in our respective homes. Last Sunday, Dr. Rosalita talked about the relationship within the community. And tonight we will be looking at our relationship with the governing authorities that we have around us. And I think this is very important because there are times that when we don't understand how our relationship with God would affect the way we relate with the authorities that God set up in our lives, sometimes we would fail to acknowledge those authorities, and then we will not be able to do what God intends for us to do. And so this evening, we will be looking at our relationship with the governing authorities that God has set in this world. But before we delve into the text, I would like to bring to you this picture that I personally took when I visited Texas, Corpus Christi in 2018. Texas, Corpus Christi is a portion of Texas that is along the sea. And the uncle of my wife drove me to different places in that state. And then we happened to pass by the First United Methodist Church in that particular area. It is a very unique scenario because in front of the church is a vast beach area. And right in front of the church, there is a statue of the Lord Jesus Christ. That photo that I took when I was there. And below that statue, there is an inscription that says, "It is I." It is I. Now, when I read that inscription, right away, my mind went back to the story in the gospel wherein the disciples of Jesus were crossing the Sea of Galilee, and then they were very tired from feeding the 5,000. They were very frustrated from those moments of waiting on the other side when they were waiting for Jesus, but Jesus didn't go to that place. And so they crossed back the Sea of Galilee, and they were trying their best. It was a struggle because they were against the current. They were against the wind. They were tired already. They were frustrated already. And then in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, somebody appeared to them, and many of them said it's a ghost. And that was the emotional scenario back then when they were there in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And then Jesus revealed to them Himself, and He told them, "Don't be afraid. It is I." Don't be afraid. It is I. The same Jesus who said earlier in the earlier context or part of the gospel story when He said, when He was in the boat along with the disciples who calmed the storm, when the waves were shaking the boat where they were in, this is exactly that Jesus who walked on water, who said to the storm, "Be calm, be quiet, be still," and the storm stopped. And these disciples were really fascinated about what kind of person He is, that even nature obey Him, that He can violate even the laws of nature. He's beyond it. Nobody can walk on water. Now, there are magicians that would try to display that they can walk on water, but it was revealed that there are glasses that they place under the pool wherein they would step on them. But Jesus, there were no props there. There were no tricks that He made. He was really walking on water. And even if the Sea of Galilee back then was a bit wavy, when there were a lot of, circumstances in that particular scenario, He walked on water. No props, no tricks. He did it in a form of miracle because He's a powerful one. Because Jesus has the authority over nature. And not only over nature, you look at the other portion of the stories in the gospel, He also exemplified that He has the authority over demonic forces. He has the authority over sickness. He was crucified, He died on the third day, He rose again. He has the authority over death. So when we think about Jesus, basically, He has the authority over everything. This Jesus, while having His authority, set up authorities around us this time. Authorities to govern us, authorities to provide order, authorities that may usher peaceful condition in our land, authorities that are used by the Lord around us. And I believe we are familiar with authorities. Because anywhere you go, there are authorities that God has set up. In your respective house, there are authorities there. Your mom is an authority. Your dad is an authority in your home. You go out of your house, by the time you get your motorcycle or drive your car, when you right away go to the road, there are authorities on the road. We have the traffic enforcers. We have the policemen. So that right away when you go out of your house, there is another authority that you got to engage with. If you are a student, you leave your house, you go to the streets, you go to your school. When you arrive inside the campus, there are authorities that God set there in that particular place. In terms of elementary and high school campuses, you have your principal, you have your teachers who are authorities over you. If you are a college student, you go to your campus in a university, there is the college president. There are the other officers. There are the department heads. They are all authorities with a particular jurisdiction. So the point of the matter is this: everywhere you go in this world, you got to engage with a certain authority. And those authorities were set up by God Himself, and He bestowed to these people who are in that particular position to operate according to His intention. And that's exactly the thing that we want to look at this evening. And we will ask the question, how are we going to relate ourselves within the authorities that God set up around us? Now let's look at the writings of Peter. Let's open our Bibles in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 17. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 17 from NASB 1995. It says there, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond slaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." May the good Lord bless the reading of His word. There is one word that I want us to take note at the very beginning of this passage tonight. Can you flash again on the screen, verse 13? The first word that you would see out of that text that we are looking at this evening is the word submit. Or in other translation, they use the term be subject. In Bisayan, the idea or the term used was pagpailalom. You be subject to an authority that God has instituted around us. You know, it's easy to submit to an authority if that particular person who enforces the authority is really doing his best and doing it in the right way. The problem becomes complicated when that person who is in authority is the pastor. If the authority set by God over me is not doing his thing according to God's intention, am I going to submit to him or her? Am I going to allow myself to be subject to such kind of person when his leadership is against God's will? Now take note, I will answer that question at the end part of this message. But before we answer that question, I would like us to better understand the word submit so that we will be able to interpret the text properly and we will be able to have the right perspective about the matter. So don't blink your eyes. Don't just go anywhere. Keep your mind here inside the worship hall and listen very carefully to what the Lord has prepared for every one of us. Let's go verse by verse and try to understand clearly. We will understand the words submit to authority with using different frames, okay? And the first frame that we will use to understand this term, submit to authority, is found in verse 13. Verse 13 says this line, submit yourselves. Take note of this prepositional phrase that says, for the Lord's sake. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Oftentimes, when we think of an authority, we submit to that person for the sake of the position that person has, right? If that person is serving as a governor, we submit to him because he's the governor. If that person is serving as a mayor, we submit to him because he's the mayor. We have a former mayor of Zamboanga City. Before, when he was in his office, anywhere he goes, people would run to him, people would converse with him, people will really go around him and talk to him. People will really care to pay attention to him. But this time when he's no longer the mayor, I can see him from time to time at KCC. And you know what? There are no people going to him. He walks there by himself as if he's an ordinary man. Why? Because often our submission to that particular person has to do with the position that he has. So when he's no longer occupying that position, the submission is gone. But listen very carefully to what the Word of God is telling us. He says here, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Not for the sake of the person, not for the sake of the position that that person has, but we submit for the Lord's sake. And the idea behind that is you are God's child. As I have told you during the first Sunday of the month, you are His child. And anywhere you go, you remain to be His child. You are God's child during Sunday. You remain to be His child on Tuesday, on Wednesday, up to Saturday. You remain to be God's child. You are God's child here at ZCAEC. You are God's child when you go to your office. Anywhere you go, what time it may be within the day, you remain to be God's child, and you bear the testimony about your God that you acknowledge as your master. So whenever you go anywhere in this world, you carry that identity as a Christian. And when your identity is not consistent with the calling that you live in, that the authority around you that God has set up would not recognize that you are a person living in submission to the authority, then you are not creating a better testimony. I can see parents here. Listen very carefully. Parents would agree with me. You will not appreciate children who are unruly and hard-headed in your home. Why? Because what parents desire as the authority in the home is that they would have children who are obedient, children who are not unruly, children who submit to the authority of their parents. That's what every parent would desire. And children who are hard-headed and unruly, children who don't know how to listen to the advice of the parents, it's not appreciated. In other words, the testimony of the child is affected in the same sense. As believers, wherever we may go, if we don't submit to the authority, the problem will be our testimony about Christ is going to be marred. It's going to be stained with the character of being a disobedient person. So that is why you look at the passage, it says, submit to the authority for the Lord's sake. Because we are God's children. Wherever we may go, every authority that God has set up around us, when we submit to it, there is going to be an appreciation to the testimony that we have because we bear the name of Christ. That's why you are called Christian. The word Christ is there. You bear the name of Jesus anywhere you go. A teacher, a principal, a school president wouldn't appreciate a child, a student, who is very unruly in the campus. Why? Because they desire to have an obedient person. Someone who abides with the rules. Someone who submits to the authority. That's going to be highly appreciated. So if you are a child of God, we learn to submit to authority, not only because they have the position, not only because they have the power, but we submit for the Lord's sake. The second frame that I would like to relate to you is found in verses 14 and 15. Let's look at the passage again. Verse 14 says this, or to governors. In the earlier part, it says, you submit whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Verse 15 says it like this, for such is the will of God, that by doing right, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, I want us to take note of the words do right and doing right. There is a line that says in verse 14, do right. God set up the authority not only to provide peace and order, but to punish the evildoers and to reward or praise those who do right. And in verse 15, after saying that to reward those who do right, you look at what Peter mentioned in verse 15. He said, therefore, you should be doing what is right. So there is a repetition of the idea, do right and doing right. There is now urging on the side of the believers to do what is right, because that is the will of God. And thus, through that particular action, we will silence those who try to accuse your life, your reputation, your situation, whatever you have. They will try to destroy your character, but they will be put to shame, because you as God's child, you keep doing what is right, for it is God's will. So we submit the first frame, looking at this word submit to authority, looking at it from the frame of for the Lord's sake. Second frame, looking at submit to authority from the frame or within the frame of because it is God's will for you to do right. Do right. You submit because it is the right thing to do. Oftentimes, our submission to authority, to the law, is affected by the kind of enforcer we have. Often. I think just last month, I came from the church. I was on my way to my marketplace ministry downtown. I was on my way there driving my car, and when I arrived at a certain place with a signage that says, no left turn, I really do not violate that. But that moment, there was someone, a uniformed man, driving his motorcycle. When he arrived at that signage that says no left turn, right in front of that very visible signage, he turned left. And I had a companion that time. You know what my companion said? Pastor, mag-turn left ka na rin. Sabi ko, bakit? Sabi niya, nag-turn left nga siya, oh. He's supposed to enforce the law. He's supposed to reprimand those violators. But before my eyes, behold, what I was saying is that this guy directly violated what is placed there as a signage, as a policy, as a law. And I said, I told my companion, I won't do that. I won't violate that particular law just simply because he violated it. No. I followed the law. Why? Because that is God's will for me to do. That is the right thing for me to do. You know, there is an idea that flows in every office that says, you know, everybody does it, do the same. Right? Even if it is wrong, I told you this last time already. Even if it is wrong, if everybody does it, do the same. Well, that's not how a believer should behave. Because if there are authorities over us and there are laws set for us, we gotta be obeying it, doing what is right. Why? Because it is the will of God. So submitting to authority must be seen with this second frame that I have mentioned. It is God's will, and that's the right thing for us to do. First frame, submit to authority. Put that statement under the lens of under that frame, or within that frame. We submit to authority because it's for the Lord's sake, for the testimony that we bear. And then we submit to authority because it is God's will. God wants us to be doing the right thing. The third frame is found in verse 16. Peter said there, act as free men. And he said, do not use your freedom as covering for evil, but use it as a bond slaves of God. You know what? We are set free from the bondage of sin. By the time you put your faith in Jesus, the chains that have been holding you for a long time. Before, when there is something that you commit in life as a sin, you don't care about it. Why? It doesn't affect you personally. There is no conscience that dictates your heart. There is no spirit that dictates about your action. Why? Because you are in bondage to sin. But by the time you become a child of God, He has set you free. And what Peter is saying here is this: yes, you are now free from the bondage of sin, but don't ever dare use that freedom to commit sin. Because sometimes you would say, anyway, I'm forgiven already. I can do anything I want. I have the freedom to do that. No. That's not the point. What Peter is saying is that by the time you are set free from the chain of sin in your life, right away you become a slave of God. Are you following me? There is no transition. There is no middle ground between the two. You are either shackled by the chain of sin, or you are a slave of God. So there is no transition. There is no gray area. You cannot say, I'll stay in the middle. No. Either you are in chain under the bondage of sin, or you are a slave of God. And so what Peter is saying is that by the time you put your faith in Jesus, you are set free. You no longer have the chain of sin in your life, and now you are a slave of Jesus Christ. And because you are a slave of Jesus, then you better do what the master would tell you to do. I told you this story before already. There was once a missionary who visited a certain place, and then he walked along the road. He happened to pass by a river, and in the middle of that river, there is a small boy trying to cross the river. And it so happened that the flow of water was really very strong. It was really rushing at that time. And the boy was caught in the middle of that river trying to figure out what he should do, because if he would take a wrong step, then probably he will be taken away by the water. So he was so scared. He was there in the middle of the river without anybody around him. Suddenly the missionary passed by and saw him. And the missionary asked him, "Boy, what are you doing there?" He said, "I'm trying to cross, but I am caught here in the middle of this current. I cannot move. I am helpless." And the missionary, with all his might, went to the boy, tried his very best to help him, and was able to manage to bring him to the side. When the boy was there by his side already, he told him, "Boy, you better go home now. You are safe." But the missionary turned his face and then started walking. While walking, after how many minutes, he noticed that somebody was following him. He looked at his back, and it was that boy that he saved. And then he said, "Boy, you better go back home." The boy didn't say anything. And the missionary continued walking. As he was walking, he noticed that the boy continued following him. And he turned to him again and said, "Boy, you go back home." And this time the missionary was quite annoyed already of the presence of the boy. He takes a few steps, the boy also would take a few steps. He stops, the boy would stop. And so he was annoyed already, and he thought, "What shall I do this time?" And he remembered that there is a village nearby where the chieftain of the tribe lives. And so he walked toward that village. When he arrived there, he knocked on the door of the chieftain. And he asked him, "Hello, sir. I have a problem here." "What's the problem, sir?" the chieftain said. "How can I help you?" He said, "Actually, it's not a big problem, but there is a little boy here who kept on following me. I have told him already to go back home, but he does not follow my words. I told him to go back home. He was just silent, following my steps." And then the chieftain asked him, "Why, what happened in the earlier part of the story? What happened earlier?" The missionary said, I was walking along the river, and I saw him struggling in the middle of the river, caught in the middle of the strong current." And the missionary said, "I just went to him and helped him, brought him to the side. And I told him, you go home, but he did not." And then the chieftain said, "Well, you may not understand that act of the boy because you do not belong to this place. You are a foreigner here. You don't understand our culture. He said, in our culture, once your life is endangered and somebody would save you, your life no longer becomes your own. Your life is already owned by that person who saved you. That is why that boy, in his mind, he doesn't own himself anymore. He's following you because now you are his master. And as I was thinking about it, I said, this is exactly the picture that we experience with Jesus. We are all doomed. We are judged already. We are standing in the current of sin, and that strong current is about to take us to eternal damnation. But Jesus came into our midst and then take us out of that current and saved us. Now we no longer own our lives. He owns us. And we are now slaves of God. No longer slaves of darkness, but slaves of God. Some translations use the word servants of God, but I think it's a weak translation. I think it is more appropriate to really use the term slaves or bond slaves of God. We are slaves of God. And because we are slaves of God, He is our master. We wait what the master would ask us to do, and that's the exact thing that we need to do because He's our master and we are His slave. Oftentimes the problem is that we often think still that we own our lives and we are the captain of our very soul. In the Christian context, no. Jesus owns us because He bought us for a price. And He is our master, we are His bond slaves. We submit to the authority of Jesus. So if you think about submitting to authority, first frame, we submit to authority for the Lord's sake. Second frame, we submit to authority because that is God's will and that He wants us to do what is right. Third frame, we submit to authority because we are bond slaves of Jesus. He bought us for a price. We belong to Him. Lastly, look at verse 17. The last frame. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. I want us to take note of the last words in this verse. Fear God, honor the king. Now, these words, fear and honor, are closely related. Both of them convey the idea of respect. And take note of the word king. It starts with a small letter, meaning to say that king pertains to a human king, a human authority, not the one who is in heaven, not the one who died for us. It is in a small letter K. It is someone like us, a human being. So Peter said, fear God, honor the king. Now these two words are similar, fear and honor. Both of them convey the idea of respecting. You respect. You honor the king, meaning to say you respect anybody who is in authority that God has set or placed over your life. When you respect someone, you put that person in a leadership position that he is going to influence you. When you respect someone, you look up to him. But with fear God, it's a higher form of respect because there is a reverential submission to the God who owns everything and who has the absolute authority. So if you compare these two advice of Peter, fear God, honor the king, which one is weightier? It's fear God. It's over honor the king. Fearing God is far greater and weightier than honoring the king. So the idea is this. I have asked you a question earlier. What if, Pastor, you've been telling us to submit to authority using those different frames. But what if? What if those people in authority are being used by the devil to propagate his mission? God set authorities around us that they may provide order, that they may provide peace, that they may punish the evildoers, and that they may reward the right doers. But what if? What if that authority violates what God wants? Shall I still submit? Listen very carefully. When the Bible advises the believers to submit or be subject to authority, it is not a blind submission. It is not an ignorant obedience. Take note. I'll repeat that line. It is not a blind obedience. I would reverse. It is not a blind obedience. It is not an ignorant submission. Because at the end of the day, the final authority is God Himself. His authority goes beyond, further than the authority of any human institution. There was one time in 11th century, there was a Danish king who received a lot of compliments from his retainers. Every day he would receive this kind of compliments and statements from the people around him. You know, O king, you are so great. You are invincible. You are powerful. Everything you say will be done. Everything you say will happen. Every day he would hear those words. Now maybe on the first time, he felt good about it. Pero habang tumatagal, na ganun na lang yung sinasabi, kung sa Bisaya pa, murabag usahay, mafili mo yaga-yaga naman kay mao na lang manipirmi ginaingon nila sa kuha. And maybe he felt bad already in the long run, and he said, actually, that's not true. What you are telling about me isn't true. I may be your king, but I am not invincible. I may be your king, but I am not that powerful. And he had something in mind, but the people would insist, you are invincible, you are powerful, whatever you do really happens. Whatever you say, would be done. Whatever you say will be happening. And he said, okay, let me prove that to you. Kindly please bring my chair down to the shore. So they brought his chair at the shore, near the water, where the waves would hit the ground and splash and can reach even the chair that they brought there. And he sat on the chair. The waves were getting bigger and they were coming toward him. And he started shouting at the waves, stop, stop. But the waves did not stop. They all went directly to the shore. It splashed on the shoreline and he was wet with water. This time another wave was coming and he made his voice even louder, stop. The waves did not stop. It continued, and he got so wet already. And so he went back inside his palace. He removed his crown and put the crown at the cross. And he told his people, you know what? My authority is limited in many ways. But this guy who died on the cross, his authority is absolute. And historians would say that that crown of that king remained there until he ended his reign as a king. My authority as a human king is limited. The authority of that person who died at the cross at Calvary is absolute. Take note of that. That is why when we ask the question, what if the authority that is placed by God would not exercise His authority according to God's intention? Shall we still obey Him? What if that authority would say everybody can kill their neighbor? Shall we do the same? We are God's children. The answer to that question is no. Why? Because our full allegiance is to God. Fear God, honor the King. We honor every person that leads us in providing peace and order, in punishing the evildoers, and in praising the right doers. But our ultimate authority is the one who holds the ultimate power, no other than Jesus Christ Himself. Don't get me wrong. I am not, and the Bible does not advocate disobedient Christians. What the Bible is saying clearly, submit to authority, okay? And that is why if I'm going to capsulize the message this evening, I will make a statement as brief as this line. This is the line that would capsulize everything that I have said. If you are a citizen of God's kingdom, you must be a good Filipino citizen. You must be a law-abiding citizen. If you are a Christian, if you are a child of God, you must be a law-abiding citizen. You must be a good Filipino citizen. Why? Because you are a child of God. Looking at this submission to authority within those four frames that I have mentioned. But at the end of the day, our full allegiance is to Christ, not to any authority in this world, because the authority of human beings are limited in many ways. I can cite examples in the scriptures that this happened in the past. Look at the story of Daniel. You know what happened? He was in Babylon. He rose to power in a very short period. You know, when you rise to power, there are people around you will become jealous of your position. So people around him got jealous of him, and they started thinking, how can we drag this person down? How can we destroy his reputation? And so they devised a plan. Let's go to the king and make him do or create a law. They told the king, oh king, you're so great, you're so powerful. You know what? It would be better if we would have a law that would ask every person, that would command every person within Babylon to bow down before you and worship you. And the king liked the idea. And so they created a law, signed it with his ring, and it was announced to everyone. All people, citizens of Babylon and foreigners who are in Babylon are to bow down and worship the king. Daniel, as a follower of God, heard that news. He did not retaliate. He did not get a placard and face the king of the palace. He did not do that. He just remained silent and tried to respect that authority and that law that was created. He respected it. He honored it. But did he bow to the king and worship him? No. Why? Because his full allegiance is not to the king. His full allegiance is to God, who was the absolute authority. And so those people who got jealous of him when that decree was given, when it was enforced already, they went to Daniel, and when the worship time happened, they really watched Daniel, and they realized that he really did not bow down to the king. Because in the heart of Daniel, I shall never bow down to any other person. I will only bow down and worship that person who has the absolute authority over my life. And he did not follow the rule. But he still honored the king. In what way? When these people reported what Daniel did to the king, he was ordered to be put to the lion's den. Did you see Daniel? Did the text tell about Daniel complaining about it, retaliating about it? No, he did not do that. He willfully followed the soldiers that brought him to the lion's den for his final execution. Yes, when we give our full allegiance to God, sometimes when the authority in the land would violate what God wants, it goes against the Lord, and we abide with God, we will reap the consequence. But still, we will abide with God, not with the king. Why? Because at the end of the day, he is the final authority. So listen very carefully. Don't get me wrong. We are not advocating disobedience to the law. In fact, if you are a citizen of God's kingdom, you submit to the authority of the land. However, when a time will come that that authority of the land will directly lead us to violate the authority of God and the will of our ultimate authority, then our allegiance must be displayed. It's not for any human king. It's for God alone. Same thing happened among the disciples in the gospel. You know what? When they were in Jerusalem, Jesus told them, go and make disciples. You preach the word. They preached the word in Jerusalem, and the religious authorities didn't like it. They told them, you stop preaching about Jesus or else. But they did not stop. They continued to preach about Jesus. And so they asked the guards to catch them and put them behind bars. They were imprisoned, but they continued preaching the gospel. They kept on telling them, stop preaching. They never stopped. Why? Because that order of the law of the land or of the authorities within the land is going against the will of God, who has the absolute authority. So we are encouraging every believer, every citizen of the kingdom, take note of this. God tells us to submit to authority. Because you are a citizen of God's kingdom, be a good Filipino citizen. But when a time will come that your faith will be challenged and that your allegiance will be challenged also, show to the world that your allegiance is not for anybody in this world, but only for the God who has the absolute authority. God bless us all, and good evening.